We're talking about equivalent ratios today. And the problem I'm talking about is called Grandma's recipe. Grandma's recipe for one batch of cookies calls for 9 cups of flour and 6 teaspoons of vanilla. So, one way to show this is with pattern blocks. If we were drawing this by hand, we would call them diagrams, but we're going to use the pattern blocks instead of the diagrams. So, for cups of flour, I think a cup kind of looks like this square. So the recipe has 9 cups of flour. And I'll just put them end to end so you can see those. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I believe that's 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 cups of flour. No reason why they should be connected there, just looks a little neater. So there's 9 cups of flour and 6 teaspoons of vanilla. So for a teaspoon, I'm going to use this little triangle. 1, 2, okay. So Grandma has a large family, so that's a lot of flour, but 9 cups of flour, 6 teaspoons of vanilla. So if you were to double that recipe, that means you would have twice the ingredients. So you would have these same amounts. Again, you would have another 9 cups of flour. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And you would have another 6 teaspoons of vanilla. So in the original recipe, the ratio of cups to flour to teaspoons of vanilla was 9 to 6. And you can see that in the first drawing I made. So now that Grandma has doubled the recipe, what's her new ratio? Well, now I see a total of 18 squares and a total of 12 triangles. So that means 9 to 6 is equivalent to 18 to 12. Those are called equivalent ratios. Now, if I want to think about Grandma tripling the recipe, I would make this 3 times. So while I'm doing this, think about what would happen if Grandma tripled the recipe. Think about her new ratio. So on my screen, if you count the total number of squares and the total number of triangles, you should see 27 squares and you should see 18 triangles. So that means it's equivalent to, lost my train of thought. So 27 to 18. Okay, I'm going to take all of this off, starting over. And let's go back to the original recipe again. 9 cups of flour. Try to separate them a little bit this time. So this is Grandma's original recipe. 9 cups of flour, 6 teaspoons of vanilla. So we talked about what happens when Grandma doubles the recipe or triples the recipe. We didn't have enough space, but we could have done 4 times all the ingredients or 5 times all the ingredients. So instead of making the recipe larger, if Grandma wanted to make the recipe smaller, she could. So the first thing I would do is I would try to cut the ingredients in half. Well, that might be easy for the teaspoons of vanilla because I can take half, cut it right there, and I would have 3 and 3. But for the cups of flour, that's not going to be an easy ratio to find because I have 9 cups of flour. Cutting that in half would cut one of these boxes in half. So the trick to finding a smaller portion is find out how many portions you can make or how many equal groups you can make out of this. Well, 9 and 6 are both divisible by 3, which means I could take a third of the recipe. If I took the third of the recipe, and I know there's probably a way to draw on this. Oh, here we go. So if I took a third of the recipe, I would break each one of these into 3 groups. And if you look at each one of these drawings, you'll see inside those, I have 3 cups of flour and 2 teaspoons of vanilla. So my original recipe was 9, and I'm terrible at writing on this. My original ratio was 9 to 6. We said that this is equivalent to 18 to 12. Those are equivalent ratios. That's what happens when we double the recipe. If we had made 3 recipes, the ratio would have been 27 to 3 times that would be 18. So notice I'm just taking these numbers and I'm multiplying them both by 2, and then I'm multiplying them both by 3. If I wanted to have another equivalent ratio, I could multiply them both by 4 and then by 5, and then I can keep going and make as many different equivalent ratios if I want. But in this picture, I made smaller recipes. See how I cut it down into equal parts? That was each a third. And each one of those has the ratio of 3 to 2. So I can either multiply both numbers by the same thing, or I can divide both numbers by the same thing. In this case, I divided both numbers by 3, so that's 1/3 of the recipe. So all 4 of these are equivalent ratios. If I wanted to find another equivalent ratio, I'll go back to my original, and I want to think about multiplying these both by 5. 9 times 5 is 45. And 6 times 5 is 30. Instead of using the 9 to 6 ratio, I could also use the 3 to 2 ratio. And I can multiply any of these numbers by any multiplier. So I'm going to take the 3 and 2, and I'm going to multiply both of those by 5. Which means I take the smaller portion, I have 5 of those. So there's another equivalent fraction. So remember, equivalent fractions are multiplying both numbers by the same thing or dividing both numbers by the same thing.